Jake Morrison had always been the type of person who took wrong turns and ended up finding something amazing. Back home in Denver, he would drive to the grocery store and somehow end up at a hidden waterfall or an old abandoned mine. His friends used to joke that Jake could get lost in his own neighborhood and discover a new coffee shop that served the best pie in Colorado. So when humanity made first contact with aliens and regular people could finally buy tickets to visit other worlds, Jake was one of the first people in line. He saved up for 2 years working double shifts at the photography studio just to afford passage on the civilian transport ship to Kepler 442, the Valdorian Empire had opened their capital world to human tourists, and Jake wanted to be there with his camera. The other humans on the tour were mostly business people and scientists. They wore expensive suits and carried important-looking briefcases. Jake wore his favorite hiking boots and carried his old camera bag that had seen more adventures than most people. While they talked about trade deals and cultural exchange programs, Jake stared out the transport window at the blue and silver planet growing larger below them. The Valdorian capital city looked like someone had grown it from crystals, instead of building it from stone and metal. Tall spires twisted up toward the sky, catching sunlight and throwing rainbows across the streets. The building seemed to pulse with soft inner light that changed colors as the day progressed. Jake had never seen anything so beautiful in his life. Their tour guide was a Valdorian named Zefka, who stood almost 7 feet tall with blue skin that had silver patterns running along his arms and face. He spoke perfect English through a translation device that made his voice sound like he was talking from inside a cave. Zefka was very serious about the rules and spent 20 minutes explaining which areas humans were allowed to visit and which ones they needed to stay away from. Jake tried to pay attention, but he kept getting distracted by how the light moved through the crystal walls. He took pictures of everything. The other tourists got annoyed because he kept stopping to photograph interesting shadows or the way alien plants grew in spiral patterns up the sides of buildings. By lunchtime, Jake had fallen behind the group 3 times. After they ate at a restaurant that served food in floating bubbles, Jake decided to wander off on his own for a while. The tour group was going to visit a museum full of old government documents, and Jake figured that would be boring. He wanted to find more of those crystal spires and maybe get some shots of how the afternoon light looked different on this world. He followed a path that led away from the main tourist area toward what looked like older buildings. The crystal structures here were darker and more complex, with patterns carved deep into their surfaces. Jake could tell these buildings were ancient even though they looked like they had been built yesterday. Everything on this world seemed to stay perfect forever. The path curved around a large building that had to be some kind of palace or important government place. It was huge and covered with symbols that looked like they told a story. Jake spent an hour just photographing the carvings, trying to capture how they seemed to move when the light hit them from different angles. He was so focused on getting the perfect shot that he did not notice when he walked through an archway into a part of the building that definitely was not on the tourist map. The hallways here were wider and taller than the ones in the public areas. The walls were covered with more of those story carvings, and the floor was made from some kind of dark stone that felt warm under his feet. Jake followed the hallway because it seemed to lead toward a source of natural light. He could see colored beams streaming in from somewhere ahead, and he wanted to photograph how they painted patterns on the carved walls. The hallway opened into a round chamber with a domed ceiling, made entirely of crystal. Light poured in from above, creating the most amazing display Jake had ever seen. In the center of the chamber sat a chair unlike anything Jake had ever seen before. It was carved from a single piece of dark material that seemed to shift from black to deep purple to midnight blue depending on how the light hit it. The chair was clearly very old, but it looked like it had been made yesterday. Every surface was covered with intricate patterns that seemed to tell stories of battles and victories and long journeys across the stars. Jake walked around the chair taking pictures from every angle. The craftsmanship was incredible. Whoever had made this thing was an artist of the highest level. The chair seemed to be positioned perfectly to catch the light from the crystal dome above. Jake could imagine how amazing it would look to sit in that chair and watch the light show happening. On the ceiling, his feet were killing him after walking around the Crystal City all day in his hiking boots. The stone floors were beautiful, but they were not comfortable for long walks. Jake looked at the chair and figured it would not hurt anything if he sat down for just a minute. It was obviously in some kind of museum or historical site, and people probably sat in it all the time. He settled into the chair with a grateful sigh and immediately felt better. The chair was incredibly comfortable, like it had been made specifically for his body. Jake leaned back and looked up at the crystal dome, watching the colors shift and dance above him. He raised his camera and started taking pictures of the view from this unique angle. The moment Jake relaxed completely into the chair, everything changed. The chamber filled with blinding white light that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Sounds started coming from the walls around him like machinery waking up after a long sleep. Somewhere in the distance, Jake could hear alarms going off and voices shouting in the Valdorian language. Jake jumped up from the chair, clutching his camera and looking around wildly. He had no idea what he had done, but it was obviously something important. The chair was glowing now with that same white light, and symbols were appearing on the walls that had been blank before. Jake could hear running footsteps coming down the hallway toward the chamber. He stood there holding his camera and wondering if he should run or try to explain himself. Jake Morrison had gotten lost again and found something amazing, but this time he had a feeling that amazing might also mean dangerous. He really hoped HFY would not be too angry with him for wandering off the tour. The first person to reach Jake was HFY, who burst into the chamber with his silver face patterns glowing brighter than Jake had ever seen them. Behind the tour guide came 6 Valdorian guards wearing armor that looked like it was made from the same crystal as the buildings. They all stopped when they saw Jake standing next to the still glowing chair and started talking very fast in their own language. Jake held up his hands to show he was not dangerous and tried to explain that he had just sat down for a minute because his feet hurt. The universal translator in his ear was having trouble keeping up with how fast the Valdorians were talking, but he caught words like impossible and the ancient laws and something that sounded like chosen one, which made no sense at all. More Valdorians kept arriving until the chamber was crowded with important-looking people in fancy robes. They formed a circle around Jake and the chair and kept pointing at both while having what seemed like a very serious argument. Jake noticed that none of them would look directly at the chair, and they all seemed afraid to get too close to it. HFY finally approached Jake with his hands held out in what Jake hoped was a peaceful gesture. The tour guide spoke slowly and carefully, like he was trying to explain something very important to a small child. He told Jake that the chair was not just any chair, but something called the Throne of Dominion that had not been used for 5,000 years. Jake asked what a Throne of Dominion was supposed to do and why everyone was acting like he had broken something valuable. HFY looked around at the other Valdorians and seemed to be asking for permission to explain. One of the elderly Valdorians in the fanciest robe nodded, and HFY turned back to Jake with an expression that somehow managed to look amazed and terrified at the same time. The throne was built by the first Valdorian emperor to choose who would rule the empire. It was connected to computers and machines all across the galaxy that had been waiting for someone to sit in it and claim the right to be emperor. The throne could read minds and test people to see if they were worthy of ruling. For 5,000 years it had rejected everyone who tried to use it, including the most powerful Valdorian leaders. Jake stared at the chair and then at all the Valdorians staring at him. He told them there had to be some kind of mistake because he was just a photographer from Denver, and he definitely did not want to be emperor of anything. HFY translated this for the others, and it started another round of rapid conversation that the translator gave up trying to follow. While the Valdorians argued, Jake started to notice that something strange was happening to him. He could understand some of their words even without the translator. Images were appearing in his mind that he had never seen before. Pictures of star maps and spaceships and planets he had never visited. It was like someone was downloading information directly into his brain, and he did not like it one bit. High Counselor Vexna arrived with what looked like half the planetary government following behind her. She was an impressive Valdorian woman with golden patterns on her skin and robes that seemed to be made from liquid starlight. Jake could tell she was very important from the way everyone else stepped aside when she approached. Vexna studied Jake for a long moment and then looked at the still glowing throne. She asked him questions about what he had felt when he sat down and whether he was experiencing any unusual thoughts or sensations. Jake admitted that he was seeing things he had never seen before and understanding languages he had never learned. This news caused even more excitement among the Valdorians. Vexna explained that the throne was bonding with him and sharing the knowledge that every emperor needed to rule the galaxy. She told him that automated systems across hundreds of worlds were already receiving signals that the emperor had returned and was calling for the old empire to be rebuilt. Jake felt sick to his stomach. He asked if there was some way to turn it off or make it choose someone else. Vexna shook her head sadly and explained that the throne had made its choice and could not be changed. The bonding process had already begun and would continue, whether Jake wanted it to or not. Meanwhile, alarms were going off all over the planet, as ancient machines that had been sleeping for thousands of years suddenly came back to life. In space, around the planet, old satellites began moving and scanning the area for threats. On distant worlds that had once been part of the Valdorian Empire, computers received messages they had not seen since the last emperor died in battle 50 centuries ago. Dr. Lisa Hartwell arrived at the palace in a state of panic. She was the chief human diplomat on the planet, and she had been in a meeting with Valdorian trade officials when every communication device in the room started broadcasting news that a human had claimed the imperial throne. She pushed through the crowd of Valdorians until she reached Jake and demanded to know what he had done. Jake tried to explain that he had just sat down to rest his feet, but Dr. Hartwell was not listening. She was staring at the throne and muttering about historical implications and interstellar law. She told Jake that he had just accidentally claimed ownership of an empire that had once controlled half the known galaxy. The situation got worse when reports started coming in from other worlds. Some alien governments were panicking because they thought humanity was trying to conquer them. Others were celebrating because they had maintained loyalty to the old empire and were happy to have an emperor again. A few were already moving military ships to either attack or defend the new emperor depending on their political views. Back on Earth, President Angela Brooks was getting emergency calls from every major government asking her to explain why one of her citizens was now apparently the ruler of a galactic empire. She had no idea what to tell them since she had never heard of Jake Morrison and had no clue that ancient alien thrones even existed. Jake sat back down in the throne because his legs felt weak and he needed to think. The moment he made contact with it again, more information flooded into his mind. He could sense spaceships moving across the galaxy and feel the locations of planets he had never heard of. Somewhere in his head a voice was welcoming him home and asking what his first imperial decree would be. Jake Morrison looked around at all the people staring at him and realized that his simple vacation to take some pictures had just become the most complicated situation in human history. The news spread across the galaxy faster than anyone expected. Ancient communication networks that had been dormant for 5,000 years suddenly activated and began broadcasting the same message to every corner of space that had once belonged to the Valdorian Empire. The message was simple and terrifying depending on who received it. Emperor Jake Morrison of Terra had claimed the throne of Dominion and was calling all former imperial territories to renew their oaths of loyalty. On Earth, President Angela Brooks found herself in the most bizarre cabinet meeting in human history. Every screen in the Situation Room showed different alien worlds where various species were either celebrating or preparing for war. Some governments were demanding that Earth explain this obvious act of aggression, while others were already sending diplomatic ships to offer their congratulations to the new emperor. The president rubbed her temples and looked at the generals and advisors around the table. She asked if anyone had any idea who Jake Morrison was and why he was apparently now in charge of half the galaxy. The answer was both simple and complicated. Jake Morrison was a 32-year-old photographer from Denver, Colorado, who had never held any political office or shown any interest in ruling anything larger than his small apartment. Secretary of State Betty Williams was on the phone with 12 different alien ambassadors trying to explain that humanity had not planned to take over their empire and that the whole thing was just a terrible misunderstanding. The problem was that most of the aliens did not believe her. Some species had been waiting thousands of years for the empire to return, and they were not interested in hearing that it was all an accident back on the Valdorian homeworld. Jake was learning just how complicated his situation had become. High Counselor Vexna showed him reports from across the galaxy that made him feel sick with worry. 3 different alien governments had declared war on humanity, thinking that Jake's claim to the throne was part of some master plan to conquer them. 2 others had immediately surrendered and were asking for instructions from their new emperor. The worst part was that Jake could not just walk away from the throne and pretend none of this had happened. Dr. Hartwell had spent hours researching the ancient laws, and the news was not good. The Throne of Dominion had bonded with Jake at the genetic level and was slowly rewriting parts of his brain to include the knowledge and instincts of an imperial ruler. The process could not be stopped or reversed. Jake kept getting flashes of information that he had never learned. He knew the names of star systems he had never heard of and could sense the location of space stations that had been hidden for millennia. Sometimes he would start speaking in alien languages without realizing it until someone pointed it out. The throne was turning him into an emperor whether he wanted to be one or not. High Counselor Vexna faced her own crisis back home, the Valdorian Republic had been built on the idea that the old empire was dead and that democratic government was better than having emperors. Now she had to explain to her people why she was cooperating with someone who claimed to rule them. Many Valdorians were angry that she had not arrested Jake the moment he sat on the throne. The situation became more dangerous when reports came in about ancient imperial weapon systems that were powering up across the galaxy. Automated defense platforms that had been drifting in space for thousands of years were suddenly scanning for threats and demanding identification from any ships that came near them. Some of them had already fired on vessels that could not provide the proper imperial codes. Jake tried to access these systems through his connection to the throne, but found that most of them would not respond to him until he proved himself worthy. The original emperor had built safeguards into everything to prevent someone from claiming the throne and immediately having access to weapons that could destroy entire star systems. Jake had to demonstrate wisdom and leadership before the most dangerous systems would acknowledge him. Dr. Hartwell worked around the clock trying to find some solution that would prevent an interstellar war. Her research into Valdorian history revealed that the throne had several built-in tests that new emperors had to pass before they gained full access to imperial authority. The problem was that these tests were designed to be completed over several years, and they had weeks at most before shooting started. The first test involved demonstrating that Jake could make decisions for the good of the empire rather than for personal gain. The throne would present him with various scenarios and judge his responses. Dr. Hartwell explained that this was normally done in private over many months, but their situation was too urgent for the normal process. Jake spent 3 days in the throne chamber working through test scenarios while Valdorian scholars monitored his progress. The throne showed him simulations of planets being attacked and asked him to choose how to respond. It presented him with economic problems affecting billions of people and demanded solutions. Each time Jake tried to find answers that would help the most people rather than increase his own power. The tests were exhausting and often seemed designed to make him fail. Jake would save one planet from invasion only to have the throne show him that his decision had caused problems somewhere else. He had to learn to think on a galactic scale and consider consequences that might not appear for decades. While Jake struggled with his tests, the diplomatic situation continued to deteriorate. The crystalline hegemony had declared their renewed loyalty to the Empire, and were mobilizing their fleets to defend the new Emperor. The Free Worlds Alliance was doing exactly the opposite, and preparing to attack any Imperial forces that entered their territory. War seemed inevitable. President Brooks authorized Admiral Pete Carver to take a fleet to the Valdorian homeworld to provide protection for Jake and the human diplomatic mission. She also sent orders that under no circumstances was Admiral Carver to take any action that could be seen as supporting Jake's claim to the imperial throne. The United States government wanted to help their citizen, but they did not want to start a galactic war. The arrival of human warships in Valdorian space only made the situation worse. Some alien governments saw this as proof that humanity was planning to use military force to support their new emperor. Others interpreted it as a sign that Earth was taking Jake's claim seriously and began making their own preparations for the return of imperial rule. Jake finished his first test, just as news arrived that the first battles had broken out near the galactic rim. Two species that had been at peace for centuries were now fighting over whether to recognize Jake as emperor or resist the return of imperial authority. People were dying because Jake had sat down in the wrong chair, and he felt responsible for every casualty. Jake was getting better at the throne's tests, but the learning process was giving him constant headaches. Every night he dreamed about battles he had never fought and planets he had never visited. The worst dreams were the memories that belonged to the last emperor who had died trying to save his people from something called the Devourers. Jake kept seeing flashes of massive dark ships that seemed to eat entire star systems. Dr. Hartwell noticed that Jake was changing in ways that went beyond just learning imperial knowledge. He walked differently now, with more confidence and authority. When he spoke to groups of people, they listened even if they disagreed with what he was saying. The throne was not just teaching him facts about running an empire, but was actually changing his personality to match what an emperor needed to be. The really disturbing news came from deep space. Monitoring stations that had been watching the edge of the galaxy for thousands of years. Ancient sensors that had been silent since the fall of the Empire suddenly detected movement in areas that were supposed to be empty space. Something large was coming from the dark regions between galaxies, and it was heading toward inhabited systems. High Counselor Vexna called an emergency meeting when the sensor data was analyzed. The signals matched patterns from historical records about the Devourers who had destroyed the original Empire 5,000 years ago. The automated systems that announced Jake's coronation had sent signals not just across the galaxy but out into deep space where something had been waiting in the darkness. Jake felt sick when he learned that his accidental claim to the throne had awakened humanity's worst nightmare. The Devourers were not just conquerors who wanted to rule the galaxy, but something far worse. They consumed entire worlds to fuel their war machines and turned whole star systems into resources for building more ships. They had nearly wiped out all life in the galaxy before the last emperor managed to hide his people and wait for them to leave. The throne's connection to Jake's mind meant he could access historical records that no one else had seen in millennia. He watched recordings of the final battles between the Empire and the Devourers and understood why the last emperor had chosen to scatter and hide rather than keep fighting. The enemy had ships that could crack planets like eggs and weapons that turned suns into bombs. Admiral Carver arrived with the human fleet just as the first Devourer scout ships appeared at the galaxy's edge. The admiral was a practical man who had spent his career preparing for war with other humans, but nothing had prepared him for dealing with enemies who ate planets for breakfast. His ships were armed with humanity's most advanced weapons, but they looked like toys compared to what the ancient empire had possessed. Jake found himself in the impossible position of having to coordinate the defense of half the galaxy against an enemy he barely understood. The throne was feeding him tactical knowledge and strategic information, but most of it was about conventional warfare between civilized species. The Devourers did not follow normal rules of combat, and they could not be negotiated with or reasoned with. The various alien governments finally stopped arguing about whether Jake was a legitimate emperor when long-range sensors confirmed that Devourer fleets were moving toward inhabited systems. species that had been preparing to fight each other suddenly found themselves facing an enemy that wanted to eat them all. The crystalline hegemony offered their ships to Jake's command and even the free worlds. Alliance agreed to temporary cooperation. Jake spent days in the throne chamber, accessing ancient imperial ship designs and defensive strategies. The Empire had built weapons and fortifications that were far beyond anything humanity or the current alien governments possessed. The problem was that most of these systems had been shut down or hidden when the Empire fell, and Jake needed to figure out how to reactivate them before the main Devourer fleet arrived. The first test of Imperial technology came when a Devourer scout force attacked a mining colony near the galactic rim. Jake was able to activate an ancient defense station that had been disguised as an asteroid for thousands of years. The station's weapons turned 3 Devourer ships into vapor, but the victory came at a cost. The energy signature from firing the weapons told the main enemy fleet exactly where to find inhabited space. Dr. Hartwell worked with Valdorian historians to understand what the last emperor had been planning when he died. The historical records suggested that he had been preparing some kind of final weapon or strategy that would permanently defeat the Devourers, but he had been killed before he could implement it. The plans for this ultimate defense were hidden somewhere in the throne's databases, but Jake needed to prove himself worthy before he could access them. Jake's second major test from the throne involved making a choice between saving a small group of people or preserving resources that might be needed to save many more people later. A Devourer advance force was attacking a research station where scientists were working on new defensive technology. Jake had to decide whether to send ships to rescue the researchers or let them die to keep the enemy from learning about the location of more important facilities. The choice tore Jake apart inside, but he made the decision that an emperor would make rather than the one that Jake Morrison, the photographer, would make. He ordered the research station evacuated, but told the rescue ships to destroy all the scientific equipment rather than let it fall into enemy hands. 300 scientists died in the evacuation, but their sacrifice prevented the Devourers from learning about weapons that might save millions of lives later. The throne accepted Jake's decision and granted him access to deeper levels of imperial authority. Suddenly, he could sense the locations of hidden shipyards and weapons factories that had been waiting in standby mode for 5,000 years. Ancient artificial intelligences that had been silent since the fall of the Empire began responding to his commands and offering their assistance in the coming war. Admiral Carver found himself working with alien fleet commanders and artificial intelligences that were older than human civilization. The combined forces under Jake's command now included ships and weapons that could fight the Devourers on equal terms, but they still faced a crucial problem. The enemy had been growing stronger during the 5,000 years since the Empire fell while the galaxy's defenses had been sleeping. Jake realized that defeating the Devourers would require more than just superior weapons and ancient technology. He needed to find the secret strategy that the last emperor had been developing, and he was running out of time to learn it before the main enemy fleet reached inhabited space and began turning entire worlds into fuel for their war machine. The main Devourer fleet arrived 3 weeks earlier than anyone expected. Long-range sensors detected thousands of massive ships emerging from dark space and heading straight for the most populated systems in the galaxy. Each ship was larger than a human city, and they moved in perfect formation like a swarm of mechanical insects that had been built for the sole purpose of consuming everything in their path. Jake stood in the command center of the ancient Imperial flagship that had been sleeping in a hidden base for 5,000 years. The ship was called the Star Crown, and it was larger than most space stations, with weapons that could crack moons and shields that could withstand the explosion of a small star. Admiral Carver stood beside him, looking uncomfortable in the alien environment but determined to help however he could. The throne had finally granted Jake access to the last emperor's final strategy, and what he learned changed everything he thought he knew about the war. The Devourers were not just another alien species that happened to be very aggressive. They were artificial intelligences that had been created by a civilization that destroyed itself millions of years ago. The machines had been programmed to consume resources and build more ships, but their creators had died before they could program in any limits or stopping conditions. This meant that the Devourers could not be reasoned with or defeated in any traditional sense. They would keep consuming and building and growing until there was nothing left in the universe for them to eat. The last emperor had realized that the only way to stop them permanently was to turn their own programming against them by making them consume something that would destroy them from the inside. Jake's plan was simpler than anything the original empire had attempted, but it required perfect timing and the cooperation of every major power in the galaxy. Instead of trying to fight the Devourers with superior weapons, he would let them win, but make sure their victory destroyed them. The key was understanding that the machines were programmed to consume matter efficiently, and they could not resist anything that appeared to be a valuable resource. Working with Dr. Hartwell and the combined alien fleet commanders, Jake began evacuating entire star systems, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of taking people to safety and leaving empty planets behind, they turned the planets themselves into massive bombs using ancient Imperial terraforming technology. The devices would not explode when the Devourers arrived, but would activate only after the machines had consumed the planet's matter and integrated it into their ships. The plan required incredible coordination across hundreds of star systems and dozens of different species. Jake found that his authority as emperor gave him the power to demand cooperation, but it was his fundamentally human approach to leadership that made people actually want to help. Instead of giving orders like an ancient ruler, he treated his allies as partners working toward a common goal. High Counselor Vexna led the Valdorian evacuation fleets, while Admiral Carver coordinated the human contribution to the plan. The crystalline hegemony provided the raw materials needed to build the planet bombs, and even the Free Worlds Alliance contributed ships and personnel. For the first time in centuries, the galaxy was truly united against a common threat. The hardest part was making the trap look convincing. The Devourers had to believe they were conquering a desperate galaxy that was throwing everything it had into a final hopeless battle. Jake positioned his most visible ships in defensive formations around key worlds, while secretly evacuating the populations through hidden routes that the ancient empire had used during the original war. The final battle began in the Kepler 442 system, where Jake had first sat on the throne. The Devourer main fleet arrived expecting to find the heart of Imperial resistance, and instead found what appeared to be a massive defensive network protecting the most important worlds in human and Valdorian space. Jake commanded the battle from the Star Crown while making sure his ships fought just hard enough to be believable, but not so hard that they actually prevented the enemy from consuming the bait planets. Admiral Carver had never fought a battle where the goal was to lose convincingly, but he understood the strategy. Human ships fought alongside alien vessels they had never seen before, using tactics that had been developed over thousands of years of galactic warfare. The combined fleet held the line just long enough for the Devourers to commit their main forces to consuming the planets that Jake had turned into bombs. The trap was sprung when the Devourer ships began converting the consumed planetary matter into new vessels and weapons. The hidden devices activated deep inside the enemy fleet, turning their own construction process into a chain reaction that spread from ship to ship. Entire sections of the Devourer armada simply dissolved as the matter they had consumed turned out to be programmed to destroy anything it came into contact with. The victory was complete, but it came at enormous cost. Whole star systems had been sacrificed to create the trap, and millions of people had died in the evacuation process. Jake felt every loss personally, because the throne's connection let him sense the death of Imperial citizens across the galaxy. The weight of command was heavier than anything he had ever imagined. The surviving Devourers retreated into dark space, but their main fleet had been broken and their ability to threaten the galaxy was ended for the foreseeable future. Jake Morrison had accomplished what the original Valdorian Empire could not manage in 1,000 years of warfare. He had found a way to defeat an enemy that seemed impossible to stop. In the aftermath of the victory, Jake faced his final choice. The throne would release him now that he had proven himself worthy and completed the tests that had been designed for emperors. He could return to Earth as a hero and go back to taking pictures of beautiful landscapes, or he could remain as emperor and help rebuild a galaxy that had been shattered by war and fear. Jake's decision surprised everyone, including himself. He chose to serve as emperor for exactly 10 years to help establish a new form of government that combined the best aspects of the old empire with democratic principles from Earth and other worlds. He spent those 10 years creating institutions that could defend the galaxy without requiring an emperor to coordinate every decision. When Jake finally stepped down from the throne, he had transformed not just the galaxy but himself. He returned to Earth with knowledge and technology that advanced human civilization by centuries. But more importantly, he brought proof that humans could be trusted with power. The galaxy had learned that sometimes the best leaders are people who never wanted to lead in the first place. The throne of Dominion sits empty again in the Valdorian palace, but now it serves as a reminder rather than a weapon waiting for someone to claim it. Tours are still available, though visitors are very carefully supervised, and no one is allowed to sit down anywhere near the ancient chair that once chose a tourist from Denver to save the galaxy.